Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Taiwan has called China a threat to stability as dozens of warplanes fly around Taiwan. This at the same time as the NATO summit, the 75th anniversary of NATO, in which a draft communique called China a systemic challenge. With me to discuss this is Professor Andrew Nathan. He's a distinguished China expert from the Department of Political Science at Columbia University. He is a pioneering American sinologist and a protege of John King Fairbank, the founder of the East Asian Research Center at Harvard University. He's undertaken over 50 years of research and has published 15 books. It's a great privilege to welcome you to the show today.
Thank you so much.
So right now, there are two places in the world where China is carrying out military drills. One here, close to Taiwan in the Pacific, and that's with the Shandong aircraft carrier, and the other one is with Belarus, actually on NATO's border between Poland and Belarus. What sort of message do you think this is sending?
I think a key to Chinese foreign policy is that China views the United States as the greatest threat to their security, to the security of their regime, to their what they call territorial integrity, which includes Taiwan, and to their access to the global economy, which is essential to the regime's survival, to the prosperity, to the ambitions of China. So I think the aircraft carrier exercises are part of Xi Jinping's long-term plan to build up a capability that will convince the United States that it cannot afford to intervene in Taiwan. And the exercises in Belarus show that China, although I don't think that China's totally pleased with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which wasn't very smart, I think they nonetheless feel that in their battle, China's battle, to guarantee China's security against the United States and its allies, Russia is the best asset that China has in that effort. And so although they're divided about the war in Ukraine, their basic decision is to support Putin's demand for non-expansion of NATO.
You mentioned that for China, it doesn't think that what Russia did was smart. There are some analysts who say that actually China benefits from this.
China benefits and China also loses from it, but I think it's not that China doesn't think it's smart because Putin isn't winning. And it's causing a lot of trouble for Russia. So that's not smart. But China does benefit in the sense that it ties up the United States with a war that the US doesn't want in Europe. It postpones the American intention to rebalance its forces to Asia. But China also loses because we see that the Europeans are joining the United States and turning against China.
Precisely that. In the communique, or the draft communique from the NATO summit, the 75th anniversary summit being held in Washington, a former US Assistant Secretary of State for Asia has called the wording, the stronger wording on China as an extraordinary step for NATO. And let me just quote some of what he said. He said it's a mark of how badly Beijing's attempt to straddle Russia and Western Europe has failed, and its claim of neutrality to ring hollow. And China's attempts at divide and conquer have instead produced that solidarity that you mentioned between the Indo-Pacific theater and the Euro-Atlantic. And also the NATO communique mentioned that the Indo-Pacific is important for NATO, given the developments in that region directly affect Euro-Atlantic security. What do you think about the language, the new language in that?
Yeah, so China has tried to divide the United States from Europe and to divide the EU internally with China's relations with Hungary, with Serbia, with the East and Central European countries, the Belt and Road, with Greece, the port of Piraeus, and so forth. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a fundamental security threat to the Europeans. And so gradually the Europeans are coming around to basically seeing that China has chosen sides with the Russians, and that threatens us, Europe. And that has brought NATO closer together, brought the European allies closer to the American position on China as a threat, not only to American interests. So in the olden days, the Europeans thought the U.S. has an interest in Taiwan, has an interest in the South China Sea, has an interest in it. That's not our problem. But now the Europeans in this statement are seeing that the China threat in the Indo-Pacific also affects their security interests.
And it's interesting that you said that the message of the two drills was to the US to say that we are building strength in the Indo-Pacific, and that's something that you have to watch. But that's coming almost full circle because the Europeans are seeing that as a threat to them. Mm-hmm. So not just China supporting Russia, yes, but even in the Pacific.
Yes, and not only the Europeans, but the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Filipinos, the Vietnamese are responding. And perhaps the most important thing is that Chinese behavior has led to a disappearance in the United States of the panda hugging, as we used to call it, the sort of can't we get along with China point of view. So that the debate in the United States is between, is our relationship with China a long-term competition, or is it a conflict that we have to win, which is now the position of most of the Republican Party. It's an existential conflict, which personally I think is exaggerating the problem. But
why do you say you think it's
well, I support the Biden administration policy, which is, in a word, managing competition. The competition with China is very, very important for the United States. It has to do with security, with economics, with the global order, with values. It's a big thing. But it's not an existential conflict in which China is going to somehow sort of cause the collapse of the United States, invade the United States, create an alternative international system of some kind. It is a question of whether the US or China will have more wealth and more influence. It's important. But I think the idea that somehow China has to lose and we have to win is exaggerated and makes the conflict worse.
So you don't believe that China is trying to set up its own world order?
I don't. It depends on what you mean by the world order. So one interpretation of the world order is it used to be unipolar, and there was one superpower. Well, that's not okay for China, so they are upsetting that by creating at least two major powers or some kind of multipolar system. Another understanding of the world order is which country has the best technology and the most money, and that's but in the sense of a world order of, let's say, the United Nations and sovereignty and things of that type, China doesn't have an alternative world order the way the Soviet Union did. The Soviet Union had a vision, all countries will become socialist. You know, China doesn't think all countries will become, Xi Jinping thought of the new era or something of that sort. So I think it is possible for China and the United States to compete within a world order. It's complicated, but it's not a whole new concept of the world order.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
I've heard or I've read into analysis where, whilst the Chinese Communist Party may, accept democracies, they expect a kind of tributary relationship with China being very much at the head and with all the power and influence. What do you make of that?
So, I mean, in 100 years from now, I suppose it could be like that. But I think China's strategic goals right now, as I said at the beginning, one is the United States military and our allies are surrounding China. They want us to back off. That includes Taiwan, very importantly. That's the key, actually, to this. Another one is, which country is going to command these high-tech AI, electric vehicles, nanotechnology, bioengineering? Because whoever controls those technologies is going to make a lot of money and is going to set the standards for everybody else. And then the third one is that China wants other countries to vote for them in the International Telecommunications Union and the World Health Organization. So China wants what the United States wants, which is military security, economic prosperity, diplomatic influence. And it's not easy for China to get those things. And what do they have? Basically, they have a lot of money. And that's what they're using. So then if we say that they're looking for, let's say, Greece to be a tributary state of China, that's not, the Greeks don't want that. Vietnam doesn't want that. Nobody, Laos maybe, yes, maybe Cambodia, but no other country really wants to be a tributary state of anybody, actually. But if you are Britain or Germany or France and you have to pick one side to be closer to, it's going to be the United States. Not to be a tributary state of the United States, but there's a lot of common interest. I don't think the road ahead for China is that easy. I think it's very hard for them.
Okay. So just returning now to the news of the two Chinese ex-defense ministers, that's Li Shangfu and Wei Fenghe. Now, they've actually been expelled from the CCP itself for corruption and political disloyalty. And the South China Morning Post said it was unprecedented that basically the Politburo decided or announced on the same day to open sort of criminal and corruption investigations into these two men. And later she told a military commission workshop, "We must make it clear that the barrels of guns must always be in the hands of those who are loyal and dependable to the party." So some people are saying that these purges are signs of weakness for the PLA. What do you think?
There are always two possible reasons why somebody is investigated for corruption. One is that they're corrupt. The other one is that they disagreed with Xi Jinping on some important policy issue, and we don't know the inside story. These guys could have gone to Xi Jinping, for example, and said, "Boss, we can't win a war with the United States." And he might have said, "Well, if that's true, you're out." But probably the answer is that they were corrupt, or maybe it's a mix of the two. And that does mean that the Chinese military is weak. It's not ready for a war. And so I agree with that. But it also shows that Xi Jinping is the first Chinese post-Mao leader who's got enough control over the Chinese political system to be able to investigate anybody that he wants to for corruption, and nobody can contradict him. So Xi Jinping's control is very strong.
Mm. How would you compare it to Mao's control?
Well, the two leaders' style was very different. Mao was a kind of chaos guy. He loved chaos. He would not pay attention for a while, and then he would intervene and cause unpredictable events. Xi Jinping seems to be very controlling. I don't know how he does it, but he seems to have enough time in the day, 48 hours every day somehow, to sort of control everything that goes on. But it's true of both of them that nobody could contradict Mao or Xi Jinping, as far as we know. From the Mao period, we know quite a lot because it's in history and we've been able to learn more. With the Xi period, it's still kind of a black box, but it looks like both of them have that attribute that they couldn't be contradicted by anybody.
Mm. So talking about weaknesses, potential weaknesses in the PLA, a year ago you gave a lecture where you said that you didn't believe China would attack Taiwan before, if it was going to attack, before 2027. Is that correct? Why did you say that?
The reason I picked 2027 was that the then Pacific commander went to the Congress and said that, in his opinion, Xi Jinping would attack before 2027. So that was how the question came up. But my assessment is that he's not ready. Xi Jinping had announced that the PLA should be ready by 2027 to attack. But I don't think, so I have two optimistic assumptions. One is that Xi Jinping gets good information, at least good enough to know what the American deployment is and what his own military is capable of, and that he's smart. And I have reasons for these assumptions, but they're not ironclad, but I have some evidence of it. But if that's true, then he knows that it would be a disaster to attack, not only before 2027, but for some time after that. The PLA is not ready. That the US is not ready to surrender. The operation would be incredibly difficult. China might lose. He can wait. And while he's waiting, he's doing what you asked about before, which is exercising the Shandong aircraft carrier and doing all kinds of gray zone operations in the hope of persuading the Americans that they don't want a war, and persuading people in Taiwan that they just better strike a deal while they can.
Mm. So speaking of that in terms of the timing, what are the other factors that would, according to you, either accelerate or delay any plan to invade?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm not sure that invading is the best strategy for Beijing. I've recently read a book that was co-edited by Matt Pottinger that has recently come out. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of that book.
I think it's Boiling Moat.
Yeah, The Boiling Moat. Very good. And there's a chapter in that book that gave me kind of a shock, which said that a blockade would be a much smarter strategy for China because it would be much more difficult for the United States to block it, and very hard for Taiwan to survive a blockade for very long. Mm-hmm. But your question still comes back. What would be the timing for China to either invade or do a blockade or some kind of mixed strategy? My own assessment, I can't put too much confidence in anybody's assessment, we simply don't know, is that Xi Jinping hopes to win the battle without either an invasion or a blockade by what I just said before, which is to persuade he sees the American political system as unstable, sees American presidents as, other than Biden, who's very experienced, but George W. Bush, Obama, Trump are people with hardly any international experience. And so the US system is creating these presidents who have very little international experience, little military experience. The American presidents don't control their own government. There's Congress and so forth. So I think he feels that the Americans, although the Americans are stupid, slowly they will understand that China's going to take Taiwan, and it's not worth the Americans paying a price. And then the Taiwanese people will understand. So that's his strategy for peacefully resolving the Taiwan issue.
So essentially to wear down US resolve and US allied resolve, right, to protect Taiwan.
And finding a good moment when the US president is even stupider than everybody else, which would be Trump.
So what do you think about, how successful Xi might be in that process? Or do you believe that the US will, uphold its values, protect democracy?
Yeah.
A lot of people say that the US is very worried about its reputation in this region.
Yeah.
And that if Taiwan was to fall, then all the other treaty allies.
Yeah, it's not only reputation, but yes, I agree. If Taiwan were to fall, the Japanese and the South Koreans and everybody else would get a message, and the Europeans. And the impact on the American alliance system would be devastating, and that would in turn affect our economic prosperity, and it would have horrible effects. But I think perhaps even more important than that is the position of Taiwan in the first island chain, and the fact that if Taiwan fell to the mainland, the Chinese Navy would be able to come and go from the South China Sea into the Pacific Ocean, into the oceans of the world, and could gradually rival the US Navy in what has been American naval dominance of the global oceans. Very, very big deal. Biden understands this. Do other American presidents in the future understand that? And then, of course, as you know, America First sentiment is just rising among the voters in the United States. They don't understand. So when you ask me what will the United States do in future years, my answer is I only study Chinese politics. I could tell you what China will do. American politics is too mysterious for me to understand.
Okay, let's get back to Chinese policy. So we've spoken a lot about war or invasion or blockade. Recently, Xi Jinping essentially celebrated the 70th anniversary of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which he said, dating back to 1954, formed the bedrock to the PRC's international relations. I'll just run through what they are. The first one is mutual respect for each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The second one, mutual non-aggression. The third one, non-interference in each other's internal affairs. The fourth one, equality and cooperation for mutual benefit. And lastly, peaceful coexistence. How do you assess the integrity of those Chinese principles?
So those Chinese principles were put forward as a critique of American imperialism and interventionism to appeal to all the other countries in the world who felt the same way about colonial, interference.
What we call now the global south, or
what we
largely
now call the global south.
Yep.
And those principles still have the same meaning today. So then if you say to the Chinese, well, you guys are interfering in the internal sovereignty of other countries, they don't believe that they are doing that. There's a parallel between the United States and China in this sense that great powers think, we're not hurting anybody else. Our presence helps you. You should welcome us. There is a bit of a contradiction in their support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but their answer to that is the Russians had to do it because NATO was threatening Russian security by expanding into Ukraine. So I think the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence are still an anti-American manifesto. They still have appeal in the global south. And from a Chinese point of view, they still describe Chinese foreign policy, which is pro-multipolarity.
If any of these global south countries have a border, though, with China, is a different matter, isn't it?
No, not really. Well, I'm not sure which country you mean, but in the case of India, the Chinese believe they're not intervening. They just have long-standing territorial dispute that the Indians won't settle peacefully. The U.S., how many countries has the U.S. invaded? And China has not done so.
It invaded Vietnam.
China invaded Vietnam, yes, it did so.
And
that
also
was a
helped.
long time ago.
Right. Not that long ago. Okay.
They had their excuse for doing
right. I guess what you're saying is the great powers do have their excuses for these actions.
Yeah, and I think if China had the capability, they would invade more countries, but they don't have that capability. Who are they going to invade?
That's looking at it from a strictly kinetic sort of military point of view.
Yeah.
I think most countries would actually view China's, especially the more recent aggressive behavior as non-peaceful.
In the South China Sea, you
In the
mean,
South
or their
China
diplomatic
Sea,
behavior?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that China's rise has elicited fear and counter reactions in the US, in Europe, in Southeast Asia, Japan, and so forth, all around the world, and in Taiwan, where the complacency in Taiwan that, we can somehow get along with China, that has not gone away exactly, but has diminished. But it is, I guess this might be a semantic question, but you're right. I was answering the question of invasion, which is a military term.
Right, yeah.
Yeah. But I think China's power is increasing and their demands on other countries are increasing. And their main leverage, as I said before, so far is economic. And they're using that leverage. And so in a lot of countries, the Chinese economic leverage creates two factions, one faction that benefits and supports it, and then the other faction that doesn't benefit, which opposes it. And so, and I think the Chinese view of, as China rises, other countries resist. Their view of that is, of course, that we knew we would pay that price. Anybody wants to resist, but we are rising, so live with it.
Andrew Nathan, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for joining Taiwan Talks today.
Thank you.